Should I say Ms.? No, I don't think I have a title. I'm titleless. I'm untitled. The Untitled Stephanie Allen Project. So I was not a kid that was drawing all the time or making things, but I was interested and curious. So I had the opportunity to see a lot because I lived very close to New York City, even though I didn't live in it. And my family was interested, and they were generous about taking us to theater. And, my parents liked going to the movies and all that kind of stuff. So there was an interest in culture. My parents listened to a wide range of music, and there was often music playing in my house. Everything from, my mother was kind of into opera, but she didn't play it so much when my father was around. But they were both, my father was really into big band jazz and singers, jazz vocalists, which is something that's really close to my heart, is old school, especially women jazz vocalists from back in the day, 30s, 40s, 50s. When kind of as soon as I could, and when I went to the city on my own, the Museum of Modern Art was, like a place where I would go and spend a lot of time on my own. So I think it was more as an appreciator and as a cultural sponge.
How have you found that engaging with art, and that could be like any form of art, has maybe educated you or changed your perspective of things like identity and culture?
For me, I think that the way that art worked for me when I was younger was through literature. I was a reader, so books were a thing, and I was really taken with other people's stories. And then I would, going back to when I was young, kind of, they became very lifelike for me. I still am a very slow reader, and I read as if I'm playing every part. Even in nonfiction, I read like I'm playing the part. So it's, I feel like I read sometimes as if I have to remember everything. And it's a way in to worlds that I don't have access to very often.
I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about the work that you've done with, I guess, like previews and movie trailers.
It's a useful skill, and more on the side of commerce, it's a useful skill. But it's tricky because I had a particular leaning into what I thought made a good trailer. That wasn't always what other people thought made a good trailer. For me, I wanted to create something that was memorable, that broke through the clutter, and that had an emotional impact, that made people curious to want to know more. I didn't really care if they were confused by the story, that I wanted them to feel like whatever the piece of material was in the trailer was like a magnet. And once they connected with it, they couldn't let go. So then you get into things like, market research, and it is commerce, and it's a business, and people want as much guarantee as they possibly can that it's the best piece of material. And, one woman's opinion does not necessarily a perfect trailer make, so to speak. So it's a collaborative endeavor, because the filmmaker has a point of view. If you were making trailers about your own films and you're wearing two different hats. So that was important to me, that it tells an emotional story before it tells a plot-driven story.
That's really interesting. You know, as you're saying that, I'm thinking how a lot of trailers that I've seen have this music in the background that's like it's not from the movie. It's like different music, and it's like very emotional music. You know, it's very climactic, or whatever it is that it's trying to convey, whatever emotional sort of response that they're looking for. But like, I always found that really irritating. I'm like, I don't like this music. It's not in the movie. Like, um, but yeah, it just goes to show how like,
That's
yeah,
part of the problem, is choosing a piece of music that will capture the attention and the heart and soul and of someone who's watching it. And often songs are so triggering in one way or another. Sometimes they trigger irritation, and sometimes they trigger like, it's in my head and I want to say, I want to go buy the album again because I haven't heard it in a while. Or what is that song? Oh my God, that's so amazing. um, so music is a huge part of creating a trailer, and any editor, trailer producer, creative director, marketing executive will tell you that, music is key, and people spend weeks and weeks sometimes trying to find the piece of music. And then sometimes you find the perfect piece of music and everyone loves it, and you can't get the rights to it. You can't license it, or it's so expensive you can't afford it. And then you spend a month trying to lay in different pieces of music to get people to feel the same way, and they don't, and they never will. And so they think the trailer sucks because you can't ever get back to that original feeling that you had from that piece of music that now you can't have it.
I wonder if you could talk about just like your process of working on one of those projects. I know I was seeing you worked on some of like my favorite movies ever, like Little Miss Sunshine, Juno, Sideways. Those are like three of my favorite movies ever. Um, but yeah, I don't know, what are those processes like for you? Just like yeah.
I would say each one is different. I mean, I don't mean that to avoid answering your question. My particular process isn't a given for every creative executive's process. So my process was watching the movie. I would always have a conversation with the director and or producer. um, that conversation was always really interesting. Sometimes it was, why did you make this movie? Why was it important? What grabbed you about this film? I think that there is, and I've said this, before, I guess, in other ways, that if a director or a writer or a producer signs, or that whole collaborative group sign on to a project, making a movie is a long haul. So you're on it sometimes for 2 years between pre-production, production, post-production, marketing, release, all that stuff. There's a big chunk of time. And in many cases, that's the only project you're working on. So you need to, like, what is it about this project that you love, that you want to spend that much of your time doing? Besides money, let's say. Some people do it because they get paid like an extraordinary fee and whatever. But so if you can hear that, that's always a great starting point about, like, if you can bottle that, that it's a good beginning. And then there's why we as a company might have acquired a movie. So those movies you mentioned, Juno was we made, but Little Miss Sunshine, we bought it, Sundance. Sideways, we made that film. So, in that one, Alexander Payne has a particular voice. The writer had a particular voice of the novel. It was quirky, pardon the expression. It was dark. It was hilariously slapstick and funny. It was a tragedy in many ways. And finding that emotional balance was really hard. And a lot of that had to do with the company that we hired to work on the trailer was a creative agency at the time called the Ant Farm. And the conversation around the poster, the first poster, not the second poster, the first poster had to do with sitting with Alexander Payne and his producer, Michael London, and going through, I had books of art. And also I knew Alexander Payne liked Polish posters, movie posters, which are very painterly and artistic. And so we went through books and I showed him different things that struck me and about why I thought that they would be appropriate for this film. And then there was a little bit of magic in the Sideways poster because the Los Angeles Times Magazine had a illustrated cover one week and I looked at it and it was there was a character like poking up his little hand, drawn head, and I just went, oh my God, that's Miles. That's the character, Paul Giamatti's character of Miles. And I sent it to Alexander and to Michael and said, what do you think of this? Do you like this style? I sent it to the creative director at the agency we were going to work with. We had also on that project hired a skateboard artist to get something more original. And they loved that guy's illustrations. And I tracked down the illustrator and all these pieces came together into a very iconic poster of the wine bottle with the characters on the green. And then the trailer used a piece of music in the back end. Like there's something when you watch a trailer, when you watch people watch a trailer, slapstick, physical comedy gets audible laughter. So subtle joke humor that's kind of clever writing and all of that stuff doesn't get as big a laugh. But the pratfall at the right time gets huge laughter. And people engage differently. They're just the whole physicality of it, the chemistry of what happens in your body when you watch it is different. And there were so many great pratfalls and slapstick moments. And then we found this Blind Melon song that we used in the end that brought in, that combined with this joke that was kind of a sophisticated joke. But also said so much about the character and the relationship and where he was and all of that. And it just, the editing and the producer, they did a brilliant job and it just worked. So it's all that to say that that's the specifics of that story, and each project has its own specifics. When it works well, it never gets tedious and you stay at a certain level of engagement. Sometimes it can go on too long because people are they're nervous, you can't find a voice for the marketing materials or a vision. Nobody agrees on anything. Everybody's expectations are different. Market research is relied on too heavily and it's killing every creative idea you can come up with, blah, blah, blah. And at that point, the process can go on way too long. And there becomes kind of a creative exhaustion that can set in, and you want to avoid that.
Definitely. I feel like, this is a big sort of fear that I have of like being an artist in like a capitalist world, of this expectation of like quality production, that art making now is so much about the end result as opposed to the process. That's something that bothers me a lot, is that, we don't value the artist's process when we see what they make, because it's invisible. We can maybe see something that we like and we're like, oh, it looks like they put a lot of time into that, but we can't really say, we don't really know. That's been an interesting kind of, yeah.
So I would say that, that is an ongoing question. And often what's really important is mastering the skills so that your, not only is your process important, but your product lives up to your process. Um, and that's not always the case. Not everyone has those kinds of skills. So mastery, there's a great expression in jazz about going to the woodshed. And I was just reading yesterday, Charlie Parker and John Coltrane, could practice up to 14 hours a day. You know your instrument when you're practicing 14 hours a day. And understanding your materials, and just there is so much. And also there's the opportunity, conceptual art, for example, is a challenge for audiences because process and inquiry, self-inquiry, inquiry about materials, about society, about art itself, about theory, becomes the conversation. And if the final, in my opinion, if the final piece doesn't engage, sometimes I look at it and I go, what the hell? Like I couldn't care less. And then you read the little didactic that they put in the museum and you go, okay, I get it. But then also then the didactic becomes part of the art? Question mark? I don't know. So that's an interesting question to think about.
Yeah. I think also like another question that I have is kind of about, and I ask everybody this question, just sort of how do we determine an objective quality in a piece of art, because I feel like everything is so subjective in our reality, in the narratives that we live in. We create them, but I think that, is there a higher art? I think we can master a skill, we can master a technique, but can we master art? It's that's
Well,
kind of a big existential crisis for me.
I don't know if you can master it, but you can have different kinds of conversations. There are many avenues for going beyond I like it or I don't like it. So you can look at composition, you can look at materials, you can ask yourself questions about why those materials, juxtaposition of this to that. You can look at color, you can look at scale, how does scale play in this piece. You can look at the aesthetics, and say, well, aesthetically it's pleasing to me, and then look at why. Well, because I like that color palette, I like those shapes, I like the geometry of that. There's a vocabulary, a lexicon that you as an artist and as a viewer of art bring to the engagement, and that's your responsibility. So I always think that in the conversation about art, the audience has responsibility. It's not just the artist. It is a dialogue. And if there's no conversation taking place, and I don't mean literally you're standing next to your piece that you made, but if there's no conversation taking place between me and the piece of art, part of that's on me.
I do agree with that. I think if you aren't facilitating a literal discussion after performing or sharing, that yes, that you have a bigger responsibility as an artist to create that dialogue.
As an audience, I'm actually saying that the audience has a bigger responsibility than
Oh
make
yes,
accountable for.
that's very true. I also think, well, this is kind of tying into another question I have, but like, I think I think it's kind of a balancing game. You have to know who your audience is. I think like depending on who your audience is, that changes your whole sort of way about starting a dialogue. For example, oh,
In
sorry.
medium or in just performance?
I think in my experience, this is specifically performance, but I think it could be true for really any sort of medium. Um, Yeah, I've struggled particularly in this community at Prescott College, sharing creative work, um, just in sort of my work is very provocative, um, and people are very easily triggered or feeling like they're attacked, in work that is shared, because the audience kind of often expects entertainment. They expect safety and security, as an audience, and I don't want to be provocative just for the sake of being provocative. I'm not trying to just shake you into thinking differently, but I hope that you will leave a seeing a piece of work, with a changed mindset or the potential to change. um, that's like my only hope as an artist. Otherwise I don't really have any expectations for how my work is received. But um, yeah, I feel like I do, like, for example, in this community, I feel like I do have to censor myself a little bit, so that I am heard. I don't come off as just abrasive and people don't hear me at all.
But
um,
you're assuming going in that your audience is not on the same page you are, so to speak.
right. Yeah.
And why are they coming in the first place? What
That's a
makes
good question.
how do you and what is the invitation that you're putting out that gets them to come?
Well, I think it's very easy to well, it's very easy and very hard in a community this small, because um, you know we all have very intimate connections. So like the people, your audience are your friends and your colleagues, and so it's not like a big performance. It's very communal, right? So and that's another thing, like a lot of fear in engaging with performance, because it's like, these are my peers, these are my friends whom I live with. What are they going to think of me after this performance, or after I show this work? And especially if it's something that's maybe a bit more thought provoking, or yeah. So that's a balance I've been trying to find, where I feel a big responsibility as an artist to know who my audience is, but also it is on them to be like, if you're uncomfortable, you leave. It's like, if you're if that's like, that's on you. That's not on me to say. I mean, now, like, we have to say, like, trigger warning, or we have to say these things, to prepare people, which I think is important. But like, I don't know. I think that how do we like balance ourselves with the needs of others, without suppressing our authenticity, to being true to our expression and creativity.
That's a good question. It's sort of makes you understand why movies have ratings. It's However, that being said, I'm several times, more than once, after George Floyd was murdered, I was watching the news. I remember I was watching something on 60 Minutes, and all of a sudden they just cut to the footage of of basically watching a murder on screen. And like, I walked out of the room or turned it off or something. And I felt that that was really irresponsible to not let audiences at home. And we're talking about a show that airs at 7 p.m. at night, on a Sunday, when and that's like another whole conversation. I think that yeah, so in terms of marketing your own work as the invitation to inviting people to come into your performances, yeah, you have a responsibility, I think, if you feel already or are concerned about triggering people, to use a common word, then to say, it's sort of the more intense version of spoiler alert. If you don't want to know the end of the mystery and who done it, spoiler alert, and they're going to go, I'm not reading any more of that review, kind of thing. So, and that's my choice. Some people want to know and don't care. So in terms of engaging with your work, if people know that you as the artist feel that this is potentially provocative, triggering, could be harmful to someone's psyche in some way, then saying so. This piece is going to deal with this, this, and this. Please, feel free at any point if you need to leave, or don't come. You're serving pork and that's all that's for dinner, but if you're a vegetarian, please know we're only having pork.
Right. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think also like I do agree with you though, is that the audience should have a greater responsibility to participate in a performance. I feel like however they're engaging, there's, it's interesting because the kind of performance I do is very intentional about bringing the audience in. Forum theater is something I've been doing recently, where we stop the performance and we ask the audience, like, what do y'all think should happen here? What's wrong with this picture? Like, and then also we have always the post-performance discussions and that has been, super helpful in terms of addressing this question of censorship and just like what triggered you, like what makes you feel attacked from this performance or this work. And that's a very informative moment, where we can actually be in the same space talking about that, as opposed to telling other people how the performance made you feel, to actually talk with the performers. I think that's that's a privilege, but
Yeah. Have you ever changed a performance piece of yours because of something that you've heard in a post-performance dialogue?
Well, no, not really, honestly. I nothing was that. I feel like a lot of the feedback that I've gotten, at least in those like discussions where we're all physically present, I don't know what people are saying when I'm not in the room, about a piece of work that I do. That's on them. But like I, from a lot of what I heard was like, I was very uncomfortable with this, but I'm okay with that.
Mm-hmm.
Being uncomfortable, and I'm like, yes, okay, we achieved something here. Like, because I mean, to some extent, I don't believe you should be comfortable seeing art. I think that it should be making you a little uncomfortable, to the point where you're questioning, where you're thinking a little more critically about things in the world. That's
Yeah, great.
so I guess like with all that in mind, overcoming sort of like fear in art, through art, with art, what has that been like in your work? Have you felt that you've been able to strengthen yourself and be more resilient and kind of overcome fear in your work?
Fear of what?
I guess fear of engagement, fear of participation, fear of what others think. I think that's the biggest one, is like, what will people think of this? What will people think of me?
My biggest fear is lack of engagement, no questions, ignoring it, dismissal, not even being able to like come up with a comment. That's my biggest fear, is that it just is, like I can walk past this and I have no interest. It doesn't do anything for the person. Like somebody looking at something and going, oh my God, I hate that, is so much better than walking in, you show somebody something and they go, nice. on to the next thing. They barely get a breath and they're on to the next thing. So
So
that's
how
the biggest fear, is dismissal. Like, it just, no curiosity at all.
so how do we like get over that that fear of engagement? Because and I think that also like that's where also why I ask about like objective quality, because I think that um just so many people that don't identify as artists, that are scared to identify as artists, feel like I'm not good enough. um you know, the work that I make, maybe I like it, maybe my friends like it, but it's not objectively good. um and yeah, I don't know how that ties into like overcoming fear, but yeah.
I would say it's not objectively good has definitely been an issue. So if I can get my own personal work to a place where it does two things. One is I know how deep my process is, and how many that there's a real evolution, and that there's a profound um, sort of research and thinking and a deep inquiry for me, and I can get it to be aesthetically pleasing to my own eye, I'm okay. And then if nobody likes it, I'm still okay. It's when I can't get it to be aesthetically pleasing to my own eye, then I'm like, that's a problem for me. And I have to work, because most stuff I do initially really sucks. I don't have good enough skills, draftsman skills, any making skills, that I'm facile with the making. So I come up with things that I would say don't require skill, but that's not true, because I have a good eye. So if I can stick with something long enough, I can usually change the aesthetics of a piece. But I've had times when I haven't. And in my grad school portfolio, I put an illustration, put a picture of a drawing that I did that's one of the ugliest things I've ever seen. And it is I don't even know how to describe it. And right next to the drawing, I wrote a big "oi" with an exclamation point, and I included it because it had to do with being able to accept some part of that as who I am as a person who makes things I call art.
Yeah, I guess like I really have enjoyed hearing people talk about this, because one of my big incentives to do these interviews and like the work that I'm doing now is trying to redevelop, an arts department at this school. There is no performing arts at all. There used to be, and all the arts courses that we have here are very sort of focused. Either on therapy or social justice. And I think that those are both really important, fields where art comes in and really develops our awareness and our, just like our immersion in those fields. But I do think that it's a dangerous sort of like thing to assign art a certain role. Where it's like art for therapy or art for social justice. Not that it isn't super effective in those fields, but that we kind of lose an awareness of what art is in its sort of like essence, I guess. Art for art's sake, I'm not sure. But yeah, I think so much. Basically, if a student wants to get into performance or a specific type of art form, it's on them. You know, there's no staff or sort of support really for them. And I think that's where a lot of fear comes from, is like, you know, no one would think to pursue you know, performing arts at a school with no performing arts department. So it's yeah.
So, I mean, you know, that's a good question for you. I'm curious, you can sort of answer that in a moment, maybe, about why Prescott, but you went there because there was a faculty member there who was into performance, right? I mean, that's what attracted you.
Not initially, but now, yes.
Yeah. And then, so in a way, there's a lot of freedom because there's no boxes at all for performance.
Right.
And, you know, I do think your point about art for art's sake, I think that there's a foundation that happens in how each of us who wants to be an artist or thinks of ourselves that way, or who uses art for problem solving, we do create our own criteria. You know, there's sort of the theory, there's different practices, those theories change. You know, there's still, going back to composition, scale, color, you know, those things when you talk about, and even in theater, in three-dimensional art making, in space with human beings moving in space, there's still composition. How do you block a piece? How do you move around? What is your space? All of that learning that happens in an art for art's sake conversation is then applied to whatever medium. You can't think about performance without thinking about visual art, without thinking about literature, without thinking about writing and language and music. And, you know, it's that we've only in the past couple of decades had a discipline called interdisciplinary is almost ludicrous. You know, it's never not been interdisciplinary. And even if you're a painter, if you look at abstract expressionists who were so influenced by poets and jazz musicians, and the whole language and the rhythms of the beat poets, for example, you know, were influenced by music. It's like, whatever, like, how can you not? Dancers. And so I think in terms of performance, everything that you're learning, it's just, in a way, performance is an additional medium and dimension to all the other mediums and dimensions that you're practicing. And if you don't think that performance is, you know, like, you can't really have art in a social justice or therapeutic environment without having, it's so performative. And I would think in both of those, I mean, even if you do street art, there's something very performative about creating a mural on a wall. You know, it's, so yeah, I mean, I think it's just a matter of how you lead that conversation. And I think it's so exciting to think about performance as part of studies of performance, as part of all of that, because therapeutic engagement with art and social justice engagement with art are all live and happening in the moment, like live theater. You know, it's that's pretty freaking exciting to put all those pieces together. So, you know, you just make it happen.
Right. Well, I really love that you said that, you know, why have we just coined this term interdisciplinary? Like, why haven't we always like thought this way about academics and arts? You know, I think that you know, a lot of schools will have an interdisciplinary studies degree or program, and they'll advocate for students to pursue that, but it's not actually happening. that there's so much competition between different departments at liberal arts schools for resources, for funding. Um, I remember one of the exercises that I did when I first came here as part of like a core class, sort of orientation class. We came up with as a group a bunch of different issues, local issues to global issues, and we put them up. I think we narrowed it down to like 4 or something, and I forget what they were, but it was like, basically like one was like racial justice, one was environmental justice, one was, all the big ones, but we separated them into different parts of the room, and then they had us go to the section of the room with the thing that we were most passionate about. And I just didn't want to leave. I didn't want to go anywhere. I was like, how could I feel more passionate about one of these things? Like, they're all huge problems. Like, and I think that in itself, it just like demonstrates the problem, is that like, yes, you can advocate and say that you're for interdisciplinary learning, but is it actually happening? Is there collaboration, and mutual effort to make that happen? And that's what I'm hoping to sort of achieve or work towards with like integrating arts, because I don't think people get how academic arts are, and how much value they have in these departments, and on their own as well, in terms of history, culture, all of these things that you can't avoid talking about, really, like wherever you're studying. I feel like. So yeah.
Yeah, the conversations are big and complex. And I hear you about, what corner of the room am I going in? I remember I've gotten a lot of surveys emailed to me, or mailed, and which is, candidates, especially before the 2020 election. And what issues are most important to you? Pick one. And like, no way, I can't pick one. And which one is at the root? So then you try to think, which one is at the root of everything? But it's a house of cards. You take one out, it's all you need all of them to be working. You need all systems to be working together. Like, so the same thing in solving problems creatively, which I do think, I guess that's for me what art is it's a creative journey to solve a problem that I really can't solve. And so a question comes up, and it's not satisfying enough for me to just like go get an answer from a book or from the internet, you know what I mean? Or watch a documentary, because there are so many other pieces. And then there's the emotional component, and how do I engage myself more fully? And that whole somatic idea of bringing your body to the conversation and to the expression and to the art, whatever it is. It's, how is that conversation happening? What's the conversation happening beyond language to solve a problem? Anyway, it's theoretically and as dialogue, it's fascinating to me. I could talk about this stuff forever.
Same. Yeah. I mean, that's where I feel like art is the most valuable, has the most to offer, is that it teaches us to kind of relax in uncertainty. It teaches us impermanence, that there's not one answer that's going to satisfy you. That, and even just with art making itself, one of my teachers says the finished product is a lie. And I feel that a lot in my work, where I'm just like, this is never done. Like, but
also, rehearsal to me, in terms of live performances, whether it's dance or theater or whatever it is, or music, orchestral pieces, bands, whatever, rehearsal to me is like absolutely the best possible environment. It's that to me is the most exciting, much more so for me personally than going to see the final performance. But also, I'm reading this book called the Jazz of Physics, or the Jazz and Physics. I mentioned it to you, I think, when we spoke. Yeah. And it's, even in that, the amount of creativity it takes and imagination to work on physics or mathematics or anything, like even creating a COVID vaccine. Like, I don't, I have no idea what RNA is, no matter how many times I read a definition of it. But whoever knew that this thing, RNA, was there, and like, oh, what if RNA could do that? And you listen to how people make discoveries. It's all like making art. It really is.
Yeah, and I think it's very strategic, that most people don't know that. That even, I mean, even just like in art itself, and like
create,
fear of it.
create a barrier. It's an intentional barrier.
Yeah, I feel like it's very strategic to have that barrier, because it's like, people feel very disconnected from ability to create anything. Um,
So astute. Yes, I think you're probably right.
because an example is like, Goethe, uh, German philosopher, artist, and scientist. He's not known as a scientist, even though he, you know, um, offered so much in biology, plant metamorphosis, and like, um, he's known as a poet and as a playwright. And his what he brought to, like, he really challenged like the kind of Western science, kind of bringing in art and creativity, in deepening one's observation. For collecting data, one must know how to see artistically. And he's not recognized for that. He's only known as an artist, which I think is very strategic. That we don't see that as intellectual. We see that as like experimental, or yeah. So it's interesting.
Whose strategy is that we run into?
Right, exactly.
Serious. Do you know? Do you have an idea?
I mean, well, I think that in the Western world, and really everywhere, yeah, it's very uh, or which one is it? Quantitative or qualitative? It's one of those. um, but where basically it's a process of categorization, and a process of labeling and deciphering, making boundaries to make sense of the world.
So
Uh,
basically, coming from a white patriarchy that
yeah,
wants
it's very colonial.
power,
Yeah,
colonial. Yeah. Okay.
yeah, exactly.
Mhm.
And I think that's a very easy excuse that people of my generation, like liberal youth, make. It's like, oh, it's patriarchy, oh, it's colonization. But it actually kind of is. It's like, it's still like very ingrained in the way we see the world. And that's what has really drawn me to art as social research, to kind of.
Well, it's just to add to what you just said, though, it's an easy excuse if that's the end of the sentence.
Right, exactly.
I think the problem is that for too many of us, that's the end of the sentence and there's no follow-up.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, and yeah, there's a lot of polarization that happens in those lack of articulation of what that means. And that's, yeah, I agree with that. But yeah, that's what's really drawn me to art, is kind of like overcoming these binary ways of thinking. To see, art, like I was saying, kind of teaches us impermanence, and it teaches us that we are in constant transformation. And yeah, to just be okay with that, to be honestly, I think it's in the West, there's this idea that like we have a very fixed idea of identity, that like this is who I am, this is what I believe, and I'm like resilient and I'm not going to change, this is me. And I think that's very scary. That terrifies me. Like I don't want to be um I think this is another thing that like keeps me engaged in art, like at this point in my life, is like I don't want to like become like an adult and I'm just like stuck in like the things that I believed or that I was taught to be true at a certain time in my life. It's like I have to keep thinking critically about things, otherwise um I feel like I'm part of the problem in a society where there's injustice or inequality, if I'm not constantly questioning the answers, basically. Yeah.
Yeah. There's the great Rilke line in Letters to a Young Poet. Do you know that? It's where he says to the young poet, live the questions, don't be butchering his language, but it's basically live the questions, don't forget about the answers. It doesn't matter. And also to remain teachable. There's another little meme-like statement that's, we don't know what we don't know. And so, those kinds of small phrases as little touchstones to tap into periodically when you feel like your ego is getting a little too swollen.
Definitely.
I don't mean you. I mean we.
Right. No, that's a constant struggle. Yeah.
What, the ego part?
Yeah, definitely. Again, the ego is like a really interesting like topic of conversation now, where some people are like, we need the ego. The ego is important. Like we would die without our ego. Really defensive of the ego. And then there's people that are like, ego's bad. You got to kill it. I am very fascinated with Alan Watts's perspective of the ego, where he's like, we invented the ego. It doesn't exist. And like,
Whose definition? Who says that?
Alan Watts.
Oh,
Yeah. And
I haven't read Alan Watts in several decades.
yeah.
But he was pretty smart back then.
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, he's been a huge inspiration to me, and like particularly with this work of like interdisciplinary arts, as well as Terence McKenna and all the greats. But yeah, that's an interesting perspective where like whenever people talk about ego in a very sort of like I guess binary way of like being good or bad, I'm always like, well, think about what you're saying. I'm like kind of like, yeah, like I don't think it's that simple. Yeah.
Yeah.
Especially, and like art is such an amazing way to investigate it, and I think artists get a bad rep. It's like that artists are egotistical maniacs, that so yeah, it's interesting like working with these sort of cultural norms, I guess, of like creativity and expression being associated with ego. And yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, it is. It's a fun concept to play with and to investigate and to know when it's getting the best of you. What's leading the way here? Which part of my ego? Then I guess you can get into a lot of definitions, but I think we're saying the same thing.
I wanted to ask you, and almost sort of coming back to this question of like, how do we overcome fear in art? And like, I know that a lot of you, one of the works that you shared with me was kind of like a mourning process in art. And I've been thinking about that a lot because this last year, 2020, Bread and Puppet which is, you know, a huge inspiration to me. They did the theme of their circus in 2020 was the insurrection services, um, or the insurrection. It was basically like the whole theme was like a memorial, and very like, you know, I was watching some interviews with Peter, and he was saying kind of how like the purpose of these performances is to lift up the voices of the deceased and to and basically hold a ritual, you know. So yeah, I guess I'm curious, like, how art has how art can be utilized as a way of overcoming grief, and yeah, how that has come up in your work.
Okay. So so what happened was that there were a lot of things going on for me personally that and I had received a letter. I can't remember which piece came first, but I was reacting to something really violently, and I had received a really awful letter. And I thought I needed to do some kind of ritual around it to change the energy, believing it, because I was really hooked in to the energy. I also am not very good expressing rage. Not to mean that I don't feel it, but when I have rage at a particular person, I tend to not trust myself so much, if that makes sense. So writing is a great tool for that. And as long as you're just writing it down on the paper, you know, sometimes people write things and they burn them, or they do other kinds of rituals around it. So my ritual for this was I wrote all of my rage, like all of it. And then I looked at it, and that wasn't the end of that couldn't be the end right there. And I didn't really, I've done the burying thing and the burning the ashes and burying the ashes, blah, blah, blah. But that somehow didn't feel powerful enough for me. So the concept of redaction, I'd done poetry from using redactions, like taking other people's work and eliminating words or taking my own work, but never quite from this place of grieving and rage, and to really shift the energy so that that's not where I leave off. And so I did that. And then I thought, now what? Because I somehow wanted a public expression of it. But, I wasn't doing a book or whatever. And I've had this idea, I've been obsessed with the concept of making bowls for what decade are we in? I guess over 20 years, like 25 years. And the concept of paper mache, and I have like a stack of journals taller than I am. And what the hell am I going to do with all of that stuff? And so much of it is, I hate what I'm doing. I'm not doing enough. Blah, 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 like self-flagellation. And then every now and then there'll be like a real wisdom thing in a journal. So I don't want to destroy the whole journal, although I have another process for doing that. And so I thought, I've been talking about making paper mache bowls for 100 years now, and I'm just going to take it. So I would take those letters, the redacted versions, and either print them out, use the original, print some more, make some copies on newsprint and whatever. And then I would tear them up and I would make these bowls. And I'm also obsessed with gauze, old-fashioned gauze that comes in a roll. And I have one box of gauze that is, it comes in the same blue paper, this beautiful blue paper that wraps around the gauze from like that they've been doing probably since World War One. You know, it's just beautiful. And I would use the gauze, and I would type on the gauze, and I would wrap the bowls with gauze, and I would soak the gauze, and I would make these objects. And to me, the objects were precious because they held so much of my experience. And the gauze, when I used that, is a healing material for healing wounds. And so whether it's a psychic wound or a physical wound, it didn't really matter to me. And so that was, and the action, you know, there's a lot of repetition. It's very meditative to do paper mache. And then it became very creative when it was done, like aesthetically, how do I want this object to look? How am I going to finish it off? Playing with different materials. And then it took on a life of its own. So those were, I've given most of them away. Some of them were made for certain people that either I wanted to, that involved healing in a relationship. And then I kind of moved some into a celebration, but it also involved, you know, some healing for the person and stuff like that. So yeah, that's that series of projects, and it's very effective for me. Yeah, I'm doing one now that I've been doing these drawings with that are very physical. It's just listening to music, all different kinds of music, and drawing for the duration of the musical piece. Sometimes with my eyes closed, sometimes with my eyes open, sometimes holding 2 or 3 different writing implements at the same time and drawing with all of them at the same time. And that is, it's almost dancing with the paper and the materials, and it's the physicality. It's way beyond language. It's even beyond, even though a lot of art is beyond language, this is beyond English language because I'm listening to the language of music. And I know you're a musician. I am not a musician. And so it's like playing an instrument that doesn't make sound, but it's motivated by sound and vibration. So now I'm working on a big piece that's, you know, like 30 by 20.
Yeah, that's awesome. I was recently talking about this with someone in another interview, and yeah, the need, you know, to bring in the physical movement into art making, whatever medium it is. And I think this is especially important for me with painting, because I get very frustrated when I paint. I get very you know, self-critical, and more so than any other artistic medium. It's interesting, you know. And I think the best part for me with painting is like when I have no objective whatsoever. Like if I'm if I don't plan ahead, if I just start painting. And this is why a lot of my visual art is very surreal, I guess, or abstract, because the result is usually something that I don't even know where it came from. Like, it just, like, I don't even feel responsible for bringing it into being. Like it came into being through me, you know. So when I'm trying to paint something, you know, specifically, you know, or if I'm trying to make it realistic, I get very frustrated. And also the way I draw is like with outlines, the way I doodle. And so I found that, you know, just kind of like experimenting more with the texture, and the movement, you know, just like I made the best part of this mural that I'm working on right now was making a night sky with stars, just like, you know, pitch black background. And then I just splattered the stars on and let it drip. And I really love when I'm not in control. of the art that I'm making. I guess I grew up with a Waldorf. You know, I went to Waldorf school, and like there's a very you know, particular way that we do painting, and that could have contributed maybe to this. I think in general, when we don't, this is where a lot of fear of engagement comes from. It's like when we don't differentiate art and technique. Um, you know, when we think that the quality of art is the quality of the technique and the commitment to the technique, which is where I clash a little bit with art in education, where I'm just like, you know, when a teacher says you're not trying your hardest or you're not putting in your all into it, it's like, well, how do you know? Who are we to say, right? And yeah, maybe they could work harder at that technique or that craft, but are they better or
Maybe,
worse at art? You know, it's yeah.
maybe that same teacher would be better serving the student by saying, are you giving it your all? Are you working as hard as you want, can be? Do you have more to give? As a question, and put the responsibility on you to determine how much of a commitment you've actually made to that piece and make you accountable for that as the artist. Then if you say, I'm giving it everything and you're not, you have to live with it. It becomes much more about your own integrity, about your own creative process, rather than about what he or she says about it or they say about it.
Yeah, definitely. Hmm. But yeah, I think um, painting is going to be a really interesting process for me, just because it's I feel so distant from it compared to other art forms. Like
Totally feel you. So I mean, it's yeah, it's been the bane of my creative labeling of self as artist.
yeah, I hear you with the paper mache. Paper mache I love because of how immersive and physical it is. You get messy. You know, it's I love the textures of it, and just like you really feel it on your body when you're doing it. Like it's yeah, I love that. I feel like we've begun to sort of talk about this idea, just talking about like art being applied in social fields and like, um, but I kind of have had this big question, just very, very broadly, like how can art be used as a way to navigate um, social justice and democracy in society, and maybe even like move towards a more democratic society through art. I think yeah, yeah. I won't say anything else right now, but yeah,
Oh man, I wish I could answer that question. I mean, I wish I knew the answer. It is definitely a question that I ask myself a lot, uh, partly because I'm terrified of fascism and I don't know how to fight it. And um, I don't know how the messaging of art can do something other than preach to a choir that's already listening. So I'm with you. I don't have an answer to that question. And I think it's a really important question.
yeah. I have been thinking about this question a lot. You know, just being at a liberal arts school that is, you know, even if you're not pursuing social justice studies, like you're in it, you know, with whatever you're doing to some extent. Um, and yeah, how to come up like what we've been talking about, so not coming off as abrasive, um, or to the point where you're like imposing your sort of ideals as an artist, your perspective on others, instead of having an actual dialogue. um,
Can't. We're too divided at this point. It's like the human psychological responses to those challenges as challenges just make us each dig in harder to what we believe. Like there is no listening going on. So that being said, which I've never quite said it like that, maybe the art practice is around listening, that the art we create isn't about what we say, but about how we listen. And how do you create performance that engages listening as opposed to what you have to say? So you as the artist, I'm going to take what I have to say out of it. I'm going to take my opinions out of it. I'm going to take all that out of it. And can I even show up to hear you? I don't think so right now. You know, it's so when many social and racial justice groups talk about transformation, so much of it is about the inner work that needs to be done. And I think for myself, I really need to let go of, or not let go, but investigate, excavate all of my own barriers, my own prejudices. You know, I have so many of them. I have the ones that are on the good guys' side. If you're a liberal, progressive, blah, 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 blah person, but not if you have a different belief system, you know, so maybe that's what it is. You know, then you can think back to all those kind of and I don't really know very much about any of them, so I'm just going to throw this out like a dilettante kind of. But when you think about people like John Cage, who I think explored silence, right? And what about a theatrical piece? You know, it's almost like a Quaker meeting where everyone sits around in silence as the performance, and you only stand up to speak when you're so compelled. And then that repetition exercise I was talking to you about with Sanford Meisner, when we had the other conversation, do you remember, from the Neighborhood Playhouse? And we did a little bit of it. So if I see a light in the ceiling above your head, and then you say, you see a light, I see a light above the ceiling. You know, it's like you just repeat what I say, but then emotion comes into it. Because then there's a point of view. Ultimately, you can't keep it out. Where as human beings, we don't keep out our point of view. So then it changes the conversation, ultimately, naturally, from an emotionally natural place. Anyway, my point, going back to listening. Maybe how we listen if that can be channeled into art.
See, I fully agree with everything that you just said, and I think what my big takeaway from that is just like how we really do need to think about who our audience is, who are we trying to reach as artists, and like, and that's where I think like this, you know, kind of perpetuating of the ego in the artist is problematic, because it's like, you know, we put the artists, they succeed and we put them in the spotlight, and then they're celebrities, and it's like it looks even more unreachable to the average person that has fear of identifying as an artist. And yeah, I think that we need to bring the focus to the audience, the listeners, instead of just like what is it like, explore, just being very sort of like in your own sort of world of which I think that's a good place to start with art, is to be very you know, independent with it. And that's kind of how I felt when I was younger, you know, doing art as a teenager. Is just like, if I want to make real, like, authentic work that feels right to me, that feels true, I need to like be fully isolated. I need to be completely on my own, uninfluenced and uninspired by any external forces, which is impossible, you know, but like that was my mindset. Like, if I want to create something like that, I have to isolate. And I have kind of fully switched, you know, 180. Like, I'm like, I need to do collaborative work, if I want to not create a very confined narrative in my work that is just really kind of just perpetuating whatever sort of biases I might already have. Even if my goal is to speak against those biases, they are still coming out. And that's where, if we think about who our audience is, like we kind of stop centering ourselves, you know, in the work. Yeah, I think that's super valid.
Yeah, I'm thinking of questions now, you know, just questions that as humans, we all, you know, like if I were to say, what hurts you? You know, what are you angry about? What would you sacrifice for someone that you love? You know, those kinds of questions that are seemingly beyond politics, even though we live in a society that is I mean, when you're politicizing health, you know, the health and well-being of human beings, you know, like we're in, obviously the health system politicized health going back, and now we've taken it to like another whole level. It's like you are this if you don't do this, or if you do this, you are that. But I think, you know, really what are basic human questions, you know, and then, so yeah, something about listening and art and social justice feel like a path, maybe.
Definitely. Cool. My last question I have here is just very broadly, what are your hopes for the future of art? And that could be in your own life, or just in the global sense of the future.
I hope that fascist leaders go away and disappear. I hope that human beings, both on a global level and on an individual level, can live with less fear. I would like systems that are seem to keep this planet somehow operating, became more humane. I would like everyone to be fed in a healthy way and have access to good food that sustains their bodies, that anyone who wants access to medical care can have it for free, that I would like the 0.01% of wealth that exists in the capitalistic global system to suddenly say, I don't need this much, and fund improvements on the planet with no strings attached. I would like the environment to be cleaned up so generations of humans could live safely and not be terrified of wildfires and all sorts of stuff. I'd like everyone on the planet to have access to clean drinking water, like basic clean drinking water, and clean air to breathe, so that yeah, and the list goes on from that. Those are my hopes. And I, you know, on a personal level, I hope more than anything that my daughter leads and lives a satisfying, beautiful life that sources her and gives her what she needs so she can give what she needs, and vice versa, and all of that.